I told my story? Like my life story?
My story? Story about what?
I've never told it out loud to anybody.
My personal story? My life story? Maybe 5 years ago?
My story? I don't know.
I don't know what my story.
My story about what?
The only time, the only time you think of is if you're talking with your kids.
My personal story? It's been a very long time.
I guess I've never told my story ever, except for maybe you when we first met. I think everyone's stories matter because you learn from it.
Absolutely, my story matters.
I don't know, it's a hard question.
Oh yeah, I think everyone's story matters.
Yes, because everybody has something to say about our own lives and experiences.
To those that I love, it does, I guess.
Probably more than we realize it does.
What I did, I don't think that really matters because I think that people should have their own stories.
It always matters.
My story definitely matters.
I think it do. Because I've been through different things.
I'm sure if I took the time to tell it, it would matter to somebody.
Welcome. This is Everyday Grace TV, and I'm Mary Andrioli, and we're glad to have you with us.
And I'm Jay Locklear. And on this first episode of Everyday Grace TV, we will be exploring the topic, why our stories matter. Thank you so much for watching.
Jay, what was it that surprised you about that farmer's market video?
The response to the very first question that you asked, when you said, when was the last time that you told your story? I'm not sure if people were responding to the time part of the question, trying to figure out when they last told their story, or if they were responding to the whole question about when was the last time they told their story, thinking about that part of it. But you could see on their faces, they were really having to process and really having to think about what their answer was going to be. Yeah. What about you?
Two things I found really interesting. One is that there were folks of the 13 that we interviewed who had never told their story. And at the same time, even with folks who'd never told their story, all the folks seemed to really think that telling their story is important. So those are the things that I found interesting.
It's interesting that I haven't told my story, but I think my story matters to somebody.
Yeah. Today we're going to have 3 guests on Everyday Grace TV. Our first guest is Laura Foley, who is minister with youth and their families at Pullen Memorial Baptist Church. She's also a bar server at Boylan Bridge Brew Pub.
We'll also be joined by Kegan Rushing, who is a hairstylist at Alter Ego Hair Salon and also an actor.
And we are delighted to have Belton Joyner, who is a creative writer and self-proclaimed student of the Bible.
As we go through this journey of Everyday Grace TV, we want you to be part of our conversation as well. So we invite you to follow us on Twitter at Everyday Grace TV and also visit our website, everydaygrace.tv. Laura, thanks for being with us today on Everyday Grace TV. I know when Mary first pitched the idea of having you on the show, I was definitely intrigued, and I'm sure our viewers are as well. So I'm going to jump right in with the obvious question. How does a pastor come to work at a bar?
Well, Jay, I do love a good contradiction. But I think more specifically that I was in school for so long. So I went from undergrad straight to grad school. And when I got my job at Pullen, I thought, man, I feel like there's just something I've missed out on. There's something to be learned from working not in the same sort of academia, internship kind of stuff.
So the obvious answer was?
The obvious answer was I'm going to work at a bar.
Exactly.
Sort of. I basically realized I did like to hang out in bars, and I met a lot of cool people there, and I thought, why not kind of jump in and start working there and figure out what that would kind of be like. And I didn't have any food service experience, so I kind of went from washing dishes and hosting, making it all the way up to slinging beers. And so it was a good time, and I think I've realized how kind of hard it is to do that job, but also how awesome it is. And so it also gave me some kind of job experience, some variation on sort of what I felt like I could do or be in the world in a way. So, yep.
Good. When we started the show, at the top of the show, we showed some footage that we shot at the farmer's market one day. And I want to ask your opinion. Mary and I talked about it a little bit. But do people's responses to those questions that we asked, does that surprise you at all?
No. I think I think partly because the way the question was phrased, I might have given you a similar response.
Now, I wrote that question. No, I'm kidding.
Not that the question's wrong, Jay, but it might have contributed a little bit to the way people answered. And I only say that because I can imagine, and it could just be my projection, I imagine that the word story for maybe just the average person or just kind of any person might feel really packaged or like really kind of tailored with a bow on it. I mean, we hear story, we think beginning, middle, end, conclusion, some sort of
I've worked on this, I've got it nailed down,
Right. And then the other thing is too, the idea that people would even need to hear that. One, that I would have it worked out, ready to tell, and then that it would be all that important that I would tell it. And so I wasn't super surprised at the video, no.
Okay. So in the work that you do then, let's start with your work as a minister with youth and families. Do you feel like you hear people's stories in that part of your life?
Not probably in a really uncensored kind of way. I think I hear some, but not maybe in a real way. Yeah.
So people are, well, kind of like what you were just saying, people are sort of hiding parts of that story maybe, or I'm going to clean it up before I tell it to you kind of a thing?
Yeah, I think that my title as a minister, I find, can hinder a little bit of that. And it can bring up a variety of things for people. And I find that sometimes I can get more if I delay kind of that title or I sort of meet them just as myself.
Sure.
I feel like I might get a little more from them. But if I do, if my title does kind of lead out in getting to sort of meet them or get to know them, I've found at least some of the time, if I'll tell something more vulnerable about my own life, then it might create a little more space. But I still think minister, church, I think a lot of that for a lot of people keeps them from telling that kind of uncensored behind the Facebook page.
Create some distance a little bit, a little off-putting.
Yeah,
okay.
Yep.
So let's look at the other side then of the picture. As a person who works in the service industry, specifically at a bar, do you feel like you hear people's stories in that venue?
I think I hear more of the stories that we're really talking about. I mean, I think this sort of authentic, what has brought them to this space in life and stuff like that. But I don't think that the people that I'm working with or the people that are sitting at the bar, I don't think that they think they're telling the story.
Right. That's not the word that they would use.
I don't think so. So like if I were to spend an hour with someone at the bar just serving drinks or whatever, and they were to walk away and you were to say, how did that feel to tell your story? They would probably go, I don't know what you're talking about. And so I think that it is safer in some ways, but I also don't think that they realize that that is their story and that they are telling their story.
Okay. Well, as Christians, we identify with a story, and it's a story that's beautiful in some places and messy and ugly in other places, but it ultimately leads us to a place of grace and hope. And I would imagine that all of our stories, some of the stories that you've talked about, some of the things that people would not even call stories, it's all pretty much the same. It's all wrapped up in there. And there's beauty, there's ugliness, there's parts that we share, parts that we hide, we don't want people to see. But I think we all have a story that we need to tell. So let's talk about how can we tear down some of those walls? How can we remove some of those barriers that you were talking about earlier and get people to tell their stories or be more comfortable sharing some of those things?
Jay, I think that having a common language is really important. I think that when people have, and it can be a common space, a common language, but when people feel like, at least I feel like I see this, when people feel like they belong, they are much more likely to be comfortable in telling their story. And it comes really naturally, and even sometimes so naturally that they might not even realize that's what they were doing. And so I think whether it's at a bar or whether it's in the consistency of a Sunday school class or if it's in a CrossFit group or really any sort of group where people really feel like, hey, I'm a part of this and I belong here, then I find that we hear a lot more stories and in the real kind of authentic way that I think is most powerful and most transformative.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I'm sitting here thinking about as you're talking, when you say common language and common spaces, in the 21st century, I think that it's wide open what's going to be a common space for people. So I'm glad that you kind of went there. We've been talking with Laura Foley on Everyday Grace TV. We want you to stay tuned. Up next is actor and hairstylist Kegan Dean Rushing.
Does she or doesn't she? Does she or doesn't she?
Color her hair? Well, that's her own affair, really. But this I will say. With Miss Clairol, the color looks so natural. Only your hairdresser knows for sure.
Kegan, welcome to Everyday Grace TV, where we're exploring why our stories matter.
Thank you.
So can you tell me, when was the last time that you told your story?
Recently, I suppose, to my therapist maybe, who works at a vet hospital.
Oh, really?
Ironically, it's amazing where you find peace.
Oh, absolutely. So do you think that our stories matter?
I do. You know, our stories are our truths, and it's what helps us be relatable to one another and find connections between each other.
Well, Kegan, you probably know as a hairdresser, there's a bit of mystique in the relationship that exists between a hairdresser and your clients that, you know, in our society. And I think that this mystique is perpetuated a little bit by commercials and by television programs. You know, we just saw a video produced by Clairol where Clairol promotes a line, "Only your hairdresser knows for sure." I'm wondering if this is a bit of a myth, if there is that type of relationship between a hairdresser and their client where people just feel compelled to tell their stories, or if, you know, or is there, what's the truth in this?
I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of truth in that statement. So yes, I would say it is not a myth. We are very close to our clients, and we do hear a lot of amazing and interesting stories.
So why do you think that is?
You know, I think there's a unique relationship that forms when it's your job to try and help someone feel beautiful inside and out. Sometimes we alter more than just their appearance. Sometimes we affect their judgments upon themselves. So, you know, people are trusting you to alter how they look, and that alone creates that arena for intimacy, you know, that trust of hearing and sharing.
So what do you do with these stories that you hear?
Well, I mean, I treat them with great care, you know. The stories that I hear, I try to hold on to and remember and channel, and it's given me a lot of empathy. So.
Are there stories that you feel have really altered you?
Yes, there's a lot.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Can you give me an example of one story?
I can. There's a woman who came into the salon about 5 years ago. She came into Alter Ego, and half of her face and hair was disfigured.
Oh gosh.
Due to burn scars. So you know, she came in there because she had been rejected by 6 other salons. So this disappointed me in the industry, and I wanted to jump at the chance to try and change that for her and her experience. So.
What did you do?
Well, I took her back to my chair, and we talked about what she wanted, and you know what I could and could not do with her hair.
Right.
And we decided to go with dreadlocks.
Okay.
She had a bit of a funky style, so we kind of went with that. And when we were finished, she said, "Thank you for seeing me." And those words that she said really struck me at many levels. But I realized then that my career was more than just doing hair. So it was about being present with another person and acting in conjunction with that person in the moment. So to truly see and want to understand one another. It's, you know, it's a reboot that we all need in this society.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Did she, I hope you don't mind me asking, did she tell you the story about what led to her disfigurement?
She did. It was a hard story to hear, but
I bet.
you know, she said that her boyfriend was mad at her one night and decided to throw gasoline on her and his lit cigarette in a match, and she was on fire. And as she's telling me the story, you know, it's what do you say, what do you do, and you just listen. And you know, what struck me again was her spirit, even in saying the story, was utterly unbroken. It was so contagious for me that I wanted to share her story with people, because she definitely moved me. So.
Have you seen her since then?
I have not. No, I would love to, but I haven't had the chance. So.
Well, Kegan, thank you for the many ways that you truly see people.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Next up, we'll talk with Belton Joyner.
I've never told my story.
I don't know, actually. I can't remember. I can't recall if I've ever told my story.
I think the last time I told my story was probably 2 weeks ago to a person that I met in school, and they were going through something, and I told them, I was like, you know, you're not the only one, and everything's going to be okay.
That's a good question. I don't know why my story matters. I have no idea.
My story matters because it's what I've gone through. It's my personal story. And my personal story, by sharing that with others, it can help others get through their trials and their tribulations.
Everyone has a story, and everyone's story matters.
All individuals, we have our own story to tell.
Everyone has a story, and everybody needs to hear what other people have to say.
Every time I share my story, it means something to me, and it like makes my story better.
It's kind of who we are. We don't have our own characteristics after we lose our story.
I think it matters because I can share it with different people and let them know that they're not the only ones going through whatever they're going through, and to just let them know that they matter.
It doesn't matter where you come from or how you got to where you're at to this day.
You can change the world through your story.
Hi, Belton. Thank you so much for being a part of Everyday Grace TV.
Thanks, Mary. Good to be here. And Jay, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Well, Belton, you've heard several different people tell their stories on Everyday Grace TV, and I'm wondering if you think that there's a connection between our personal stories and God's story.
Wow, yes, indeed. The biblical story, God's story, is so real because God sometimes seems so very present and sometimes so far away. I'm thinking about perhaps the most familiar passage in all of the Bible, the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. And that, you know, that's part of the story, and that's good to hear. But the chapter just before that, Mary, the 22nd Psalm, the one that Jesus quoted on the cross, says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And my story is like that. Sometimes God seems very close, and sometimes God seems far, far away. Like when I pick up a newspaper or go on the internet to look at the news, and I see a story and I think, wow, God is present in that. Isn't that wonderful? And then I look at the next story and where is God in that? Well, long answer to say, yeah, I think our stories and the biblical stories do connect with one another.
Belton, when I was listening to Kegan's interview a little bit earlier, Kegan talked about the woman who came in and she said to him, thank you for seeing me. And I was thinking about words that Hagar used in her story about being seen. And I wonder if there's a way that maybe you could recall that story for us and for our viewers, what that story where that connection may be.
Yeah, be glad to. It's one of those stories, Jay, that I think you look at and you think, wow, that's in the Bible, that kind of stuff. I mean, you know, it's that kind of story. It's back in the first book of the Bible, book of Genesis, about the 15th, 16th chapter, right along in there. And it starts with Abram and his wife. Abram is kind of the big brouhaha around the community. And he and his wife have no children, but they keep remembering that God had promised them, Abram, you're going to have a child who's going to have children, who's going to have children, who's going to have children, going to have children. You get the picture. So many that it'd be more than counting the stars. You just won't be able to keep up with it. The only problem was that Abram had not had child number one. Well, his wife Sarah had an idea. She said, look, Abram, I've got this slave girl named Hagar. Yeah, she's not bad for the eyes, if you know what I mean. So why don't you and Hagar have a baby? I'd have to say this is not exactly a traditional marriage. Well, Abram was old, but he wasn't an old fool, so he agreed. And he did, well, sometimes the Bible said he slept with Hagar, shacked up with her, you know, hooked up with her. And guess what? 9 months later, there was going to be about 8 pounds and 6 ounces of proof of their unusual relationship. So now, here's Hagar, and she is walking around as the mother of Abram's child. And you can guess what happened around the community. You know, she's beginning to show a bit, you know. Right. So folks are looking to say, you know, she's the mother of Abram's baby. Isn't she wonderful? And folks started oohing and awing over Hagar, and Sarah, who was Abram's wife, she sort of faded into the background.
Oh, goodness.
And Hagar herself even took on a certain contempt for Sarah, you know. Well, you might imagine Sarah didn't take too kindly to all that, so she really began making things really rough on Hagar. Really, you can imagine. She was still a servant after all, and the Bible said she dealt harshly with her, and your mind just runs about all the kinds of things she might have done. So finally, Hagar has had enough of that, and even though she is heavy with child, she runs away. So now, instead of being kind of the toast of the town, Hagar is out in the wilderness where there's no food, no water, no diaper service, and God must have seemed very far away. But God sent a messenger. Sometimes in the Bible they call them angels, means God's messenger, who said to her, Hagar, what's going on here? And you think about it, in all of the story, that's the first time anyone called her by her name. Before that, she was, you know, Sarah's slave or servant or the maid girl or maybe just, hey, you know, it wasn't, she had no name. But God's messenger calls her by name. To me, that's pretty powerful.
Names are important.
They are indeed. So she goes back to the village, but now she knows she does not go back alone. God is with her. God has seen her. It turns out that God knows Hagar and knows her story. And Hagar is so moved by that, she creates a new name for God. She calls God El Roi. It's a Hebrew word that means the God who sees me. That word can also mean mirror. I think it's a great image. God can see what's in my mirror. You know, I like that. Well, that's good news and it's bad news. It means if God can see, there's no place to hide from God. But, praise God, it also means that God who loves me knows my story, warts and all, and still loves me. So I guess in some way, Hagar's story is our story of a God who sees.
Well, Belton, let me ask you, then can God's grace be found in something as simple as our stories?
Yeah, that is, that's right to the heart of the matter. It's a good way to put it, because when I hear someone else's story, in a sense, I've become God's ears for that story. When I see someone else's story, I've become God's eyes for that story, God's presence through me. So it becomes a rather remarkable thing that I've become the presence of God, because God has used me to hear and to see and appreciate and to be in touch with that story of someone else's. So that's God's grace. And yeah.
To see and to be seen, to hear and to be heard. We've been reminded of that in a powerful way, how important that is. Belton, I want to thank you for being with us today on Everyday Grace TV.
Sure, good to be here.
We're going to end today's episode with a new song called Tell Me the Story, performed by myself, Adam Seat, and Jimmy Creighton. Thank you so much for watching Everyday Grace TV. Tell me the story. Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of life. Lend me more of their beauty, see, wonderful words of life. Words of life and beauty, teach me faith and duty. Tell me the story of the God who came with redeeming love and unfailing grace. Tell me the story. Sweetly echo the gospel call, wonderful words of life. Offer pardon and peace to all, wonderful words of life. Jesus, only Savior, sanctified forever. Tell me the story of the God who came with redeeming love and unfailing grace. Tell me the story. How a Savior came to seek the lost, how he left his throne to bear the cross. Tell me the story. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, good news. Christ the Blessed One gives to all.